It's incredible how fast news travels these days, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Blink and you miss it.
One minute you're seeing a headline, the next everyone's got an opinion, and, well, it can be a real challenge to figure out what the core of the story actually is.
Mm-hmm. And what the, potential consequences might be. It gets messy.
Totally. And in that kind of information whirlwind, taking the time to really dissect a specific event.
Yeah, to look at it from multiple angles, using the sources we have.
Yeah, it becomes more important than ever.
Agreed.
That's precisely what we're setting out to do today. We're going to take a deep dive into a rather intriguing situation. It involves a signal chat,
right,
some prominent figures from the Trump administration, and a report in The Atlantic that definitely stirred things up.
It certainly did. The focus is on potential information shared related to planned U.S. strikes against the Houthis in Yemen.
Okay, so for this, we've gathered a range of perspectives. We've got articles from The Atlantic, obviously, but also Town Hall.
Breitbart, Fox News.
And even some chatter from the conservative online community.
It's a collection that really highlights the different ways this whole thing is being interpreted. You get very different flavors.
Exactly. And our goal for you listening is to sort of navigate through these different accounts, understand the sequence of events as best we can.
See what the key points of contention are.
And consider the potential wider implications, all while, try not to get bogged down in just the partisan back and forth.
Sticking to the facts, as reported, across these varied sources. That's the aim.
Okay, let's unpack this then. It all began with the Atlantic's report. What exactly did they say happened?
So the initial report came from the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Right.
And it centered on his claim that he was accidentally added to a Signal group chat. This was back on March 13th, 2025.
Accidentally, wow.
Yeah. And this chat, he reported, was meant for senior Trump administration officials. The purpose. Coordinating planned U.S. military strikes on the Houthi rebels in Yemen.
And Signal, that's the encrypted messaging app, right?
Exactly. Often picked for its security features.
Right.
But, using it for official government business, that can still raise questions.
About record keeping, oversight.
Precisely. Things like the Federal Records Act, which actually led to a lawsuit we'll probably touch on later.
Okay. And who are these senior officials allegedly in this chat?
Well, The Atlantic named quite a few heavy hitters. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. CIA Director John Ratcliffe. Vice President J.D. Vance.
The VP?
Yep. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. And White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles.
That's a seriously high-level group. So what did Goldberg actually report seeing in this chat that set off alarms?
Well, Goldberg stated the chat contained what he initially called war plans.
War plans. That's a strong term.
Very strong. He elaborated a bit, mentioning precise information about weapons packages, targets, and timing for the strikes. And also operational details, things like the specific targets, the U.S. weapons involved, the planned sequence of operations.
So quite specific, then.
He even pinpointed a message from Secretary Hegseth, saying Hegseth texted him what he called war plan at 11:44 a.m. on March 15th.
And the worry is, obviously, that kind of info getting out could be dangerous.
Hugely dangerous, potentially jeopardizing military personnel, the operation itself. I mean, that's the implication.
Right.
And he also made another really serious claim, that CIA Director John Ratcliffe put the name of a CIA undercover agent into this Signal chat.
Whoa, okay, that's definitely the kind of detail you'd expect to be handled with extreme caution.
Absolutely. Extremely sensitive, if true.
So given these pretty serious allegations, what was the Trump administration's response? Did they just let it sit?
Oh, no, not at all. They didn't take these claims lightly. They issued quite strong and immediate denials.
Okay, like what?
Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was very blunt. He stated repeatedly, quote, nobody was texting war plans.
Just flat-out denial.
Pretty much. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz also hit back publicly. He tweeted, there were, and again quoting, no locations, no sources and methods, no war plans.
Okay.
He added that foreign partners had already been notified strikes were imminent. So the message from their side was firm. This wasn't sensitive war planning.
What about the White House itself? Did the NSC weigh in?
Yes. The White House National Security Council acknowledged the Signal chat happened. They didn't deny its existence,
Right.
but they framed it very differently. They characterized it as evidence of, quote, deep and thoughtful policy coordination between senior officials.
Thoughtful coordination. Okay.
And they asserted that the ongoing success of the Houthi operation demonstrates that there were no threats to troops or national security. Basically, no harm, no foul, and it was just routine work.
And the claim about the undercover agent, that seems like it needed a specific rebuttal.
It did, and they addressed that directly, too.
Yeah.
Vice President J.D. Vance clarified on Twitter. He said Director Ratcliffe was just naming his chief of staff, and that the chief of staff is not an operative.
So a staff member, not an agent in the field.
That was their clarification. CIA Director Ratcliffe himself backed this up publicly, saying, quote, in fact, I released the name of my chief of staff who is not operating.
Okay.
And to sort of seal that, Chief Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell put out a statement affirming the messages contained, quote, no classified materials or war plans shared.
So you have this initial report raising major security flags, immediately countered by the administration saying, nope, standard coordination, nothing classified here.
Exactly. It sets the stage for these very different interpretations of the same basic event.
Which is where our other sources come in handy, right? To see how others framed it.
Precisely. And Town Hall, for instance, offered a really strong counter-narrative. They basically argued that the Atlantic oversold the whole story.
Oversold it. How so?
Well, what's interesting here isn't just the what happened disagreement, but the battle over the narrative. That term war plans.
Yeah, it's powerful.
It really is. It evokes immediate danger, top secrecy, grabs attention. The administration, meanwhile, wants to project competence, control. So they emphasize routine coordination.
Makes sense. So how did Town Hall back up their claim that the Atlantic overplayed it?
They really focused on the actual messages that eventually came out, the supposed war plans.
The content itself.
Right. Town Hall stressed that these messages contained, and I'm quoting them here, no names, no targets, no locations, no units, no routes, no sources, no methods, and no classified information.
Basically, none of the super sensitive stuff you'd expect in a real war plan.
That was their point. They even quoted Pete Hegseth, making a pretty sarcastic comment about them being some really shitty war plans.
Okay.
So their argument was the evidence just doesn't match the initial, dramatic claims.
It sounds like they felt the alarm bells were rung way too loudly based on what was actually in the messages.
That's the gist.
Yeah.
Town Hall also pointed out what they saw as a kind of shifting language from the Atlantic. They noted how the description of the information seemed to change over time, from maybe top secret initially down to classified, and then maybe just sensitive.
Interesting. A watering down, potentially.
That's what Town Hall implied. Both they and the Department of Defense's Rapid Response account on X, formerly Twitter, kind of mocked this apparent shift in terminology.
Like the Atlantic maybe realized their initial framing was a bit too strong once the messages were seen.
That's certainly the implication Town Hall was making. They went so far as to conclude that by actually making the chat public, the Atlantic basically admitted that, quote, no war planning was going on as they had falsely alleged.
Strong words.
Very. And it's worth noting, Hegseth himself didn't hold back either. He personally attacked Jeffrey Goldberg's credibility, calling him deceitful and highly discredited.
So things got personal, too.
Definitely some personal animosity injected there.
Okay, so this initial clash of narratives, it didn't just stain the media sphere, did it? There were real-world consequences.
No, it definitely spilled over. For example, Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. He called for the resignations of both National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
Wow, resignations. Directly based on the Atlantic report.
Directly in response to that initial report, yes. That's pretty significant political reaction.
It absolutely is. Any other fallout?
Yes. A government watchdog group, American Oversight, they filed a lawsuit.
A lawsuit? About what?
They're alleging that Hegseth and the other officials involved in that signal chat might have violated the Federal Records Act.
Back to the record-keeping issue with using apps like Signal.
Exactly. By using a non-official, potentially non-secure platform for these communications. So it underscores the potential legal and, ethical questions around using these kinds of apps for government business.
Okay. Beyond the official responses, the media coverage, the lawsuit, this also sparked conversations elsewhere, right? Like in online communities.
It did, which gives us another layer. On the Our Conservative subreddit, for instance, a really interesting discussion popped up.
About this incident.
Well, relatedly, about the possibility of Pete Hegseth being considered for Secretary of Defense in a potential future Trump administration.
Ah, interesting timing, given his role in this whole signal chat thing.
Very interesting timing. And it revealed a lot about how some people view his qualifications separate from this specific incident, but obviously colored by it.
So what were the main points being raised there? Concerns about him as a potential defense secretary.
A lot of the discussion focused on his qualifications for such a huge, complex job. People brought up his military rank. He was a major in the Army National Guard.
Which is relatively junior for that kind of position, typically.
Right, compared to the usual four-star generals who get the job.
Yeah.
So there was concern about a perceived lack of experience commanding really large combined military forces.
Like joint operations, complex logistics.
Exactly. Some Reddit users also questioned if he really understood the current big challenges facing the active-duty military, things like defense industry manufacturing problems, military housing issues.
Kind of the nuts and bolts of running the Pentagon.
Yeah. One user on the subreddit put it pretty bluntly. Bad pick. I don't think he has the experience to know how the combined forces work together.
So the core worry was about breadth and depth of experience for the top job.
That seemed to be a major theme. There were also some comments about his potential priorities, noting his public focus on things like the erosion of military values and leftist ideology, which led some to be skeptical about his experience with, say, general personnel management or the more logistical side of the DoD.
But I imagine it wasn't all negative. Were there arguments for him?
Oh, yeah, definitely arguments in his favor, too. So people argued his more recent combat experience could actually be a good thing.
How so?
Offering a perspective maybe less common among very senior officers who've been in strategic or political roles for a long time.
A ground-level view, perhaps?
Kind of. The sentiment, a good major is better than a shitty general, even came up, suggesting rank isn't everything. And the idea was floated that maybe someone like Trump would want an outsider, someone to shake up what some see as an overly politicized top military brass.
An unconventional pick for unconventional reasons.
Possibly. People also mentioned his education, Princeton, Harvard, and the fact he was apparently considered for VA secretary before.
Suggesting he's been vetted for high-level roles previously.
Right. Points in his favor, according to some users there.
So it sounds like within that online community, there was a real mix of opinions on his suitability.
Absolutely. The Reddit discussion showed a pretty wide range. Strong opposition based on experience, but also a more cautious wait-and-see vibe from others. Much like the reactions to the signal chat incident itself, really.
Which brings us back then to the central point of contention in this whole situation. If you had to boil it down, what's the fundamental disagreement here?
At its core, I think the fundamental disagreement is all about interpretation. How do you interpret the information shared in that signal chat? How sensitive was it, really?
Right.
The Atlantic, initially at least, framed it as a potentially dangerous leak of sensitive war plans, implying a major breach of security protocols.
Okay.
On the flip side, you have the Trump administration and its allies insisting very strongly it was just routine coordination.
Yeah.
Nothing classified, no actual war plans discussed or compromised, just talk.
And the specific language use war plans versus maybe attack plans or just sensitive information, that's clearly a huge part of this, isn't it?
It's critical because the terminology shapes the whole perception of how severe this was. War plans. That sounds incredibly serious, like detailed strategic documents.
Whereas the administration argues it was more like a general status update about an operation already greenlit.
Exactly. A very different level of sensitivity implied by the different terms.
Okay. So to just recap where we are. A reporter gets accidentally looped into a high-level digital chat about military strikes.
Right.
Which then explodes into these dramatically different stories about what information was shared, how risky it was, and what it all means.
That sums it up pretty well. The available info, especially the chat excerpts that were released, they definitely leave room for interpretation. And as we've seen from the source...
Atlantic Town Hall, the admin statements.
Distinctly different narratives have definitely emerged. No doubt about that.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what's a final thought for our listeners to maybe chew on?
Well, maybe think about this. We live in this incredibly connected world, right? Communication is instant across all sorts of platforms. So how do we strike the right balance between the absolute need for secure, confidential communication at the highest levels of government?
Which is vital for national security.
Absolutely vital.
Yeah.
And the public's legitimate right to know about potential security lapses or, questionable judgment.
That's a tough balance.
It really is.
Yeah.
And regardless of how you personally interpret the details of this specific incident, What does it tell us about how sensitive information is managed or maybe mismanaged and perceived in today's really fast-paced media environment? And maybe one last thing. As you've heard these contrasting accounts today, from different sources with different potential angles, just take a moment to critically think about the motivations, the possible biases.
That might be shaping each narrative.
Exactly. As you form your own conclusions about what really happened and what it all signifies.